to the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast and My Security TV. And we've got a special interview with CyberArk, Thomas Fikentscher, the Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here, thanks.
Wonderful. We're going to be talking about, well, obviously CyberArk is in the privileged access management space. Certainly introduce the audience to CyberArk and some of your key sort of product offerings. It's a big space. We're going to also be talking about identity management and identity security. It's a challenge for enterprise. Sort of introduce yourself and CyberArk.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thomas Fikentscher, my name. I'm the Regional Director. I joined the organization in March this year. Previously having spent more than 20 years in multinationals in different parts of the industry, but then I joined the cybersecurity industry at a very interesting time. And CyberArk is one of the leaders in the cybersecurity industry, came into the market in the late 90s, but has been sort of the first organization that defined the area of privileged access management and has been innovating for a long period of time in that particular area.
Well, we're going to be looking at sort of, again, that privileged access management. Maybe talk us through and how you can elaborate on the privilege first approach. We have covered this in the past, but again, the privileged sort of, and where are enterprise at the moment in adopting that privilege first approach, both from your product's end, but also from the client end as well. Where do you two meet in the middle, I suppose?
Yeah, so I think if I describe what I call the problem space a little bit more, is there's multiple trends at the moment that are intersecting. And what's happening is you have a proliferation of cloud services in the market. So more and more organizations using public cloud services. Some of them are the well-known platforms like Amazon and Azure and Google Cloud Platform. And they're easy to provision, they're easy to procure, and more of these services are coming into the market, so they're quite popular. At the same time, you have like a distributed workforce, and I think the last 8 to 12 months with COVID has accelerated that distribution of the workforce. So people are everywhere, and they're trying to have access from all sorts of different locations to these services. So that's the second sort of element of that trend. And the third one is agile business models. People want to be very quick. They actually want to stand up, new ideas and services in no time. And obviously then you want to be quick. You want to have access to a service, use a public cloud service. So all of these things are coming together. And then probably on top of that, you have people who are changing roles frequently. And they not even staying with the same company, that temporarily work for a company or work for multiple companies at the same time. So all of that leads to a big challenge, because you're provisioning these accounts and providing access to many people for services temporarily, sometimes for a longer period of time. And that is a challenge for security, for IT. So what we talk about least privilege is we need to make sure that everyone who uses these services only has the right to access services when they need them and where they need them, rather than providing standing access and infinity access for everyone, because that causes a massive problem for cybersecurity.
I think that would have been a big challenge this year. How would an enterprise have handled 2020? There's been a lot of layoffs, and even temporary ones, from large enterprise, and then they suddenly have to close those accounts off. If they didn't have a sort of privileged access management program or tool set, would have been a real challenge. Most of those accounts would have stayed open. People would have been potentially disgruntled, and that internal threat sort of rises in that risk profile. How does the CyberArk solution kind of start to really give that power to an enterprise to control those accounts?
So first, you're right, it has been a very big challenge, and it continues to be one, because lots of organizations don't return to the same model that they have before. So they don't come back to their internal network. They actually want to have a hybrid model and leave people in their home offices and in remote offices as well. So from that perspective, that continues. We have found all sorts of issues. We have found accounts that have been open for a year after someone had left the organization. That's obviously a security risk. We have found accounts where the password hasn't been changed for 20 years. So there are lots of problems. Ouch, exactly. So one of the things that we've recently launched as part of our cloud portfolio is a service called Cloud Entitlements Manager. And what we're doing here is we're actually monitoring cloud accounts, and that could be humans accessing it, but it could also be machines continuing to work or talk to other machines. It could be certain service accounts that are actually being created. We monitor them and we identify issues with privileged access. So we basically find where standing access has been given. We find hidden access. We find unused access. And we actually lift it to the surface. And from that perspective, it allows us to remediate those problems and provide guidance and gradually remove these overly permissive accounts, over entitled accounts in an organization, and overall make the use of those services much more secure. So that's our approach to the market.
And you're doing that automatically. The system starts to is it learning the usage and what's not being used? How does it actually work?
So it's an artificial intelligence engine underneath. What it does, it actually monitors consistently log files and user records. And from there, it actually has an algorithmic approach to build what we call policies. And it does it at a granular level. So it builds policies for every single identity.
Right.
So you've got to be careful, because if you actually abruptly remove those permissions, you might have an impact on productivity of users.
Yeah, sure.
So you've got to understand what's going on. So you collect the data first, and then you develop the policies for every identity. That's how it works.
But you can give it sort of search criteria to go look for, accounts that haven't been used for 30 days, those types of things as well, or certain privileged accounts, and sort of report on the activity on those accounts as well. Is it giving you almost a productivity report in a way as well, as to what accounts are open, how long they're open, when they're being opened?
I think the productivity component is almost like a side benefit. Yeah. The first thing is you want to identify where you have holes in your security posture.
Correct.
But you get a productivity report as well, because you see that, some individuals have a lot of access and they never use the access. So it's open for 90 days and we identify that it's completely underutilized. So yeah, you get that as a side benefit, yes.
Do you get a potential insight into exfiltration of accounts that, again, particularly outside of normal business hours? I imagine you get control over that as well, in terms of what accounts are open and when they're opened. Yeah, what type of granular control can you start to implement?
Pretty granular, because it actually analyzes all the targets as well. So if you have, for example, someone and a particular identity and it has access to multiple different services, you can actually analyze, all these target services, and you can see what people do or don't do with those services. From that perspective, it allows you to provide, as I said, that sort of guidance in terms of what kind of policy you want to establish per identity. So it's fairly granular.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest benefit as well is it's fairly easy to establish. So it's an intuitive user interface. A lot of people talk about user experience these days. You don't want to have any sort of complex mechanism. It's an easy to use user interface, and it has zero footprint in terms of installation. So it doesn't need any sort of agents or connectors. You can actually install that in. We typically do that in under 1 hour.
Wow. Okay. So, and again, that's a good question. Sort of a good answer to a question I should ask is, what's the implementation process for this? You basically release it as an agent, and it starts to learn. What's the installation and implementation of CyberArk?
It's not an agent. It's actually going to a cloud console of one of the big public cloud platforms like AWS or GCP, and in there you configure that as a service.
Yeah.
And then it starts to obviously connect to the different log files and the records and starts to analyze. So it doesn't require an agent or any connector. So it's very light. It's pretty much zero footprint.
Right.
And that makes it very the benefit realization kicks in very quickly.
What type of criteria does an enterprise need to have in order to take it on board? So let's say you've got 1,000 employees, you need to start to set up sort of the roles and responsibilities and the policies, or do you need to build it from scratch, or can it adopt a lot of what the enterprise might already be using?
adopts what the enterprise are already using. And I think one of the criteria is multi-cloud. Many organizations now using multi-cloud services. They're not just tied to one cloud provider. They're actually having certain applications running in one public cloud provider area and then other things in different ones. So it's not like all the eggs are in one basket. So if you have a multi-cloud environment, it's already beneficial because it actually sits on top of that and it actually looks at all the different elements of the different clouds and brings that in some information to the surface. And that's the biggest benefit. And most organizations I'm talking to, they've been embarking on a multi-cloud strategy rather than a single cloud strategy.
Absolutely, yeah. The multi is certainly the way to go. And privileged access management, PAM, is definitely a journey that a lot of enterprises are on. Pre-interview, you mentioned identity security. How are you approaching this? That might be different.
We always use the term identity is the new perimeter. And as I alluded to before, the people used to work in very secure corporate networks. And, you have your firewalls and you have all sorts of controls for people to not come into that space. But now, as you move outside of that world, you're adding more and more devices to the internet, you've got a very different landscape right now. So at the end of the day, can you create the same controls in someone's home office that you have in your corporate network? And then you have thousands of home offices. No, you can't, because you have all these different individual islands and bubbles. So at the end of the day, you've got to start with the identity of someone. And there's lots of identities: human identities, machine identities, application identities. The identity is what connects us to our device. So you gotta work out what kind of security you wrap around identities, and it should be as granular as possible, because people have access to certain data and certain secrets and information that sometimes is probably benign and sometimes it's highly critical. So when we talk about privileged access, that's someone who actually has a lot of control and a lot of influence on certain settings, and they can manipulate, obviously, information. But even business users these days, they actually, with digital transformation being very, very popular, they access information temporarily. And by the nature of what they do, they become a privileged user. And if it's only for 2 hours, for half a day. So we got to understand what these identities are and wrap security around it in the most granular fashion as possible.
And you might have different identities using the same machine, or obviously the same application from the same machine. So you can start to control it at that level as well. So we've given the time of the year, I don't want to date this particular interview either, but we're coming to the end of 2020, moving into 2021. The hybrid work model is likely to stay immediate, at least for the immediate term, but most likely for the longer term. What are the challenges? I mean, are you seeing an uptick in business, and particularly here in Australia and New Zealand region?
We do. I think what's happening in Australia right now, with the fact that a lot of breaches have been happening, even this year. I mean, every week there is something new, and there's some high-profile candidates that have been breached. I mean, think about Toll Logistics twice, companies like Lion, BlueScope Steel, so brand names. I think the awareness is kicking in that there is a bigger problem on the horizon, and we have seen organizations now starting to more proactively engage, starting to engage us earlier. So we see certainly an uptick, and I think that will continue. On top of that, the government has made a lot of noise. I mean, Scott Morrison has been in front of the press and said we are under attack, and we need to actually get our act together as a country, because otherwise we're going to jeopardize the digital transformation that is supposed to happen in Australia. There's a huge opportunity to be a front runner, but it could be out of balance if you don't get your security elements right around that digital economy. So I think there is a good opportunity for us to grow further in that space.
One of the key sort of trends that's come up, certainly since the Australian cybersecurity strategy came out, the more focus on critical infrastructure, and there's a lot more discussion around the OT tech environment as well, and making sure that that's protected. The crossover between, we talked about hybrid and multi-clouds, but more in the operational tech side as well. How can identity security start to assist in that? Are you finding the IT and the OT mix coming into your application?
They're merging. They're emerging quickly. I saw some numbers recently when people talk about IoT devices, and then when you think about the OT world, a lot of things is IoT devices being added to the networks. I think currently we've got about 7.5 billion devices connected, and I think the growth rates between now and 2030, by 2030, should be 25 billion IoT devices connected. So it's huge, that figure. And people use IoT devices to collect data and information, but they're not necessarily running segregated networks, because as soon as you start to integrate, you want to collect the data and do something with it. So it actually integrates into your corporate IT and into sort of data lakes that people are using to analyze and review information. So even if you have some sort of faraway IoT device next to a railway track that somehow monitors, rolling stock, that could be an entry point for a cyber attack, and it goes all the way back into your corporate IT. So from that perspective, yes, we work in that area very strongly. We also work with partners sometimes who actually allow us to, every device that is added to the network is registered, and the identity or the credentials on that device are managed by us. So we understand what these devices do, how they behave, and we can actually monitor that as well. And identity security absolutely extends into OT.
What's the onboarding process? So you've set up your identity security platform, but you then suddenly, you talked about 25 billion devices. What if you do have sort of a new piece of infrastructure coming online, or suddenly, we're back to post-COVID and your 1,000 employees are returning back to work? What's the onboarding process? How is that automated as much as possible, and that policy sort of deployed across new identities coming on?
Yeah. I think one of the things that differentiates our business is we have a very strong partner network and a marketplace of solutions that are actually interacting with us, because we cannot do everything in cybersecurity. We have obviously a very strong focus on privilege as well. So we're working with partners who, for example, have capability to create what we call an asset register. So whenever there's a new device being added, they actually capture that is registered, and then they exchange the information with us. So we understand the device has been added, and that's a partner solution that captures that, but we then actually have access to managing the credentials and managing the identities that are actually using that device. So that's how it interacts. We do a lot of work in building these automation levels when it comes to APIs that talk to each other, and that's what we call our marketplace. So we've got lots of solutions, companies like ServiceNow, ForeScout, Tenable, you name them. We collaborate very strongly, and I think honestly, cybersecurity is a team game. So we believe in that philosophy. Okay,
so you've mentioned some key partners there. How, I suppose, what's your takeaway message for the enterprise coming into 2021? And I suppose, how can they reach out to CyberArk as well?
I think the biggest problem that we have in the market is not necessarily a lack of technology. I think there's a lot of technology. I think the problem that we have is a little bit of complacency. I mentioned before, people are waking up to the threat, but when I look at executive level and board level, it's still sometimes perceived as being too hard, and it's been postponed. Now, the fact that many organizations have been hit right now with horrendous impact. I mean, some organizations, like recently hedge funds, had to close the door because of a cyber attack. I think starting to wake up organizations, but it needs to infiltrate the boards as well. And board members, they're personally liable sometimes for breaches as well, need to understand there's a thing called digital risk. Yeah. And once you actually understand that, you start to develop a philosophy. And your philosophy could be to establish least privilege across all of your identities. You follow a certain model, like a zero trust model, but you've got to monitor that, and you've got to analyze your risk. And I think that level of complacency still exists. The technology is there. I think we just need to make sure that people allocate money, allocate time, so the right resources, and understand that they can work with organizations like ours to develop a philosophy, a blueprint, and tackle that problem. I think that's my message for 2021 in particular, as we go, in the next 12 months.
And obviously, yeah, you can assist with those conversations and assist those CISOs presenting to the board in terms of the business value. I think from a sort of a director viewpoint, I'd be interested in the productivity reporting that you could give as well. But that sense of granular control around identity and account access is pretty critical, particularly when you've got those critical assets, the digital assets that you need to protect. So, look, Thomas, thank you so much. How do we reach out to CyberArk? I imagine it's cyberark.com?
It is cyberark.com. We've got a great team here in Australia as well. All the functions are present in country, and yeah, we are certainly ready to support anyone who wants to engage with us.
Wonderful. Well, look, we've been joined by Thomas Fikentscher, the Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand at CyberArk. Thank you very much for joining us on My Security TV and the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Good man. Thank you very much.